Hey everyone, welcome to our first week and our first video of the first week in ENST 390. It's time to talk about sustainability, and this video is going to give you a little bit of an intro, probably some review for a lot of you who have taken courses that have discussed principles of sustainability in the past. Before we jump into the material though, I just wanted to say a little bit about the role of these videos in our class here this semester. Overall, basically the idea is that the videos give you some context to get started and pair along with especially the readings and other materials that I'm assigning for you in class these first several weeks of the semester up until about the midterm point when we will switch gears and talk a little bit more, focus a little bit more on the research projects that you do. So the videos I'll probably end up sharing, let's get our PowerPoint going here. About 1 to 3 videos per week, depending on what we're covering that week and how much material I want to have in the videos versus what we'll have in the reading and class discussions, either on Zoom or in person. I'm going to try to keep them short. They always end up being longer than I expect, so apologies for that. I know the one that I did for the syllabus, I finished it up and I'm like, oh damn, it's 35 minutes long. So I'm sorry that sometimes they go a little longer than I want, but I'll try to be succinct where I can. They're basically things that you should take notes on like any other class material. Imagine that we're in class and I'm lecturing, I'm droning on. You got to take notes on that stuff so that you have an understanding of it, both for what you're putting into your projects, what you take away from the class as a whole, as well as our discussion time. It's really a good preparation for discussion to take some notes and really pay attention to the things that I highlight and the things that I ask questions about. And you'll see at the end of this video, I gave you some very specific, explicit questions that we'll use in class this coming week in week 1 to talk about issues related to sustainability and sustainable development. When you're viewing the videos, I'm going to try to give you 2 options. One will be in our Google Drive folder that's shared with you. So there's a video there that you can just watch. And I'm also going to put them on my YouTube channel. And the reason I'm putting it on YouTube, besides for the fact that I want to blow up as a YouTuber, is that YouTube does a good job of providing automatic captions. And so for anybody who really benefits from seeing the words of a video along with listening to the words and the other action that's happening, because there's a lot of action in these videos, you can have that transcription for you and watch that, read that along with what I'm saying. So if you're somebody who's a learner who helps to have that written text along with the actual audio and the video of the recording, make sure you do that. And sometimes it takes Google a while to create that transcription. So I don't think that the one for the syllabus overview is ready yet. However, if you go to YouTube for this amazing garden video that I shared with you earlier in the summer, there is actually a transcription there that's available. If you go down in the bottom of the screen, you see this little CC down here. If you click on that, it will bring up on the screen a transcription caption for the actual video. And it does a pretty good job. There's a couple things that it didn't get in that garden video that I could fix, but it got almost everything right, even some kind of technical flower words like nasturtium or zinnia. It got all those. So I think it does a good job. And again, if that's something that's a benefit to you, go for it. Take a look at those in that location, and I'll try to keep on top of that and make sure that the captioning does appear once Google has a chance to kind of churn that out. Also for point of reference, when I said about blowing up on YouTube, check it out. 62 views so far for this video and 5 likes. So not bad. Watch out, PewDiePie. Coming your way. Ooh, top 20 greatest guitar solos of all time. I'm definitely going to be watching that later. So let's talk about sustainability in general. Again, this is something that you probably have come across in other courses, so this might seem kind of basic, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, because this is a course where this is going to be a really important term for us to think about. A lot of our projects are based broadly in principles of sustainability. So we want to kind of define and critique this term early on in the semester. And everybody knows, or probably a lot of you have heard this classic definition from the World Commission on Environment and Development, sometimes called the Brundtland Commission, that met in 1987 and developed this really kind of classic canonical term definition for the term of sustainability, and that's meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So there's this idea that we're always balancing what's happening now with the future. So there's an important time dimension to the way we think about sustainability in a lot of cases, that we always want to think about what's going on now, what are our goals, our trends for the future, and how can we kind of have a balance or a compromise between those different generations, those different time periods. As we'll see when we get into the Cates et al. Article on sustainable development, both later in this lecture as well as our discussion in class, they critique this definition for being kind of vague on that time frame, like all future generations forever and ever and ever. But that's the basic idea, is that there's embedded in it this kind of ethic or value about making sure we don't screw up the world and ruin the ability of those future generations to have a quality of life that we would want to have for ourselves, and that we're not going to take that away from them. So it's a feel-good definition. It's one that's also relatively easy to grasp. I think that's one of the main reasons why it's actually been so successful as a definition, because it is something that you can kind of grab onto and take hold of, and it makes sense in that way. Along with that, we almost always talk about sustainability in terms of the three pillars: the ecological, the economic, and the social pillars. We'll get more into those when we talk about, again, the Cates et al. Article and the Bostrom article, which is one we'll talk maybe a little bit more in Wednesday's class, which says that the social dimension often is the kind of overlooked, understudied, neglected dimension of sustainability. Again, here the idea is that these pillars are all important, they're interdependent, and we have to really look at them in an interdisciplinary way, and why in environmental studies we so emphasize interdisciplinarity, because we need to look at all those different dimensions, from the natural, the social sciences, and the humanistic practices as well, that help us understand ethics and justice and stuff like that. So I won't go into too much detail there, because again, I think probably a lot of people are familiar with those, and we'll be coming back to them again and again, because one of the key requirements of your research projects is that you take a focus that really looks at all those dimensions of sustainability, or really at least highlights a couple of them in a lot of depth, even if you can't get all three of them in as much depth as each other. It's something we're going to focus on a lot. I'd say also too, just kind of methodologically, that if we're thinking about sustainability as a concept, this is actually a really good example of how you can dimensionalize a concept. Give it dimensions to break it down and make it a little bit more workable, something that we can actually do research with. Sustainability, we've got that classic Brundtland Commission definition about the needs of the future, the needs of the present, balancing them out. That's kind of a little broad, a little vague. Once we start to break things down into those ecological, economic, and social dimensions or pillars, we start to get a better handle on the methods, the concepts, the tools that we can use to do research. So we're going to come back to that again as well as you start to develop the research questions behind your projects, because you're going to want to find dimensions and indicators that will help you grab onto and use tools and methods to do the research that you need to do. So that's just one example. As I said, we're going to go back to that eventually. So leading into the concept of sustainable development, which really is the focus of the Cates et al. Article on what is sustainable development, we want to talk a little bit about sustainability and start to get to the point where we can move from the definition into some questions and challenges and critiques of the term that will help us to maybe be a little bit more reflective about what it means and what it means for us, and what are some of the pros and cons of it as a term of analysis and a tool for us to use for doing our our projects in class this semester. And overall, I think the first thing that we can ask is sustainability, is it necessarily always good? I think that's an association that we have just kind of at a gut level, that if something is sustainable, it must be good, right? There's kind of a warm, a fuzzy connotation around the term sustainability, but is that necessarily true? Is something, just because it's sustainable, necessarily a good thing? And again, the Cates et al. Article, I think, helps us to really see some of the challenges of that term and ask questions about it. A couple more things that we could follow up on before we go into a little bit more depth on that article are the idea of seeing sustainability in its context. What is our culture, our society, the set of institutions that we have in our current life like? And to what extent is sustainability a reflection of that? And does it have embedded in it certain assumptions, certain ideologies and perspectives that might make us think sustainability is good? But if we were to step outside that, maybe we wouldn't think it's as good. And for instance, does sustainability take development, the idea that there's this kind of sense of progress, sense of growth that we should always have, for granted? And behind that, this idea that capitalism, which obviously is built on profit, built on accumulation and constant growth, otherwise you get in trouble if you're a CEO or a shareholder, that's kind of embedded in the idea of sustainability, capitalism. It's embedded in the idea of capitalism. And so if sustainable development is to some extent buying into that idea, does that create kind of a challenge or a contradiction in terms for that particular term? It also tends to have kind of an anthropogenic focus. What does that mean? It means it's kind of human or people-centered, so that when we're talking about these current generation versus the future generation, are we talking about all of the earth and all different types of species, or is it more about generation of people now and people in the future that we want to make sure that the earth is available for them as a resource? So in ways, you could say that it kind of treats the earth, resources, other species as kind of a means to an end to support the lifestyle, the goals, the good of people now and people in the future. And is that too human-centered of a focus for how we might want to think about sustainability in a broader way? It also assumes that we can have a pretty good sense of what the earth can handle, both now and in the future, that we're saying, well, maybe we should dial it back a little bit so that we can leave some stuff for people in the future. But do we really know? Can we predict well what the carrying capacity of earth resources are, so that we know what we can use now and what we can still have left over in the future? It assumes that we have the tools, the science, the knowledge, the future predictability that would help us make those kinds of calls about that time span. These are the set of questions that Cates et al. Help us really get into in this article. I think probably a lot of you have read this article before. It is kind of one of the classic hits in environmental studies here at Colgate. It's used in a lot of different classes. You might call it like the Hotel California classic rock hit of environmental studies. So if you've read it before, it's a little bit of review. If not, then you're seeing it for the first time, but you may see it again in other environmental studies courses that you take. The reason I think that a lot of us assign it as a reading is just it does a really good job of diving in and investigating what sustainable development means and what maybe it doesn't mean. What are some of the ambiguities or some of the contradictions that are part of that term? And they go into a good bit of depth on that. And that's something we want to interrogate and talk a little bit more in class this week, go to some depth on it, help us move forward on our projects, as I was saying before. So I think the key point that they make is that sustainable development is a somewhat flexible and even ambiguous term that can support a lot of perspectives and ideologies. So that whether you're kind of a little bit more to the left or the right on the political spectrum, what your priorities are in terms of the different pillars, social, ecological, economic, or other different perspectives that you might have, sustainable development is ambiguous enough that it's allowed people to kind of jump onto it. And again, as we said before, it kind of has this feel-good connotation that provides a broad tent for people. But just because it's a broad tent doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. It could say that, well, it's a broad tent, but because of that, it's not necessarily critical enough or maybe specific enough. And so that's one of the key issues I think that Cates et al. Are getting us to think about in terms of how sustainable development is defined, but also how it's used. And they go through a lot of examples of ways that it's used internationally as a set of standards, metrics, practices, agreements, consortiums, institutions that are all based around sustainable development, how to implement it, how to measure it, how to track it. This is going to be really important for us when we get more into our projects, because we'll see that in a lot of cases, the way that we define sustainability from a practical point of view often is in terms of different types of metrics, ways to measure and keep track of it. A good example of that is LEED building certification. Maybe you've heard this before, that when we built certain structures on campus, like the Trudy Fitness Center, our new Career Services Center, the Benton Hall, those were LEED certified as gold or platinum and got this kind of stamp of approval to say that you added up enough points in these metrics for sustainable building practices to achieve a certain level of certification. And we'll actually read an article next week, I think it is, where I did a little bit of a critique of that for some of the standards that we follow on our campus, and we can talk about that in more detail. But in a lot of ways, sustainable development has become a set of measurements that we can kind of follow. And Cates et al. Talk about some of the different ways in which those are implemented around the world and in different contexts. And overall, I think they say that despite some of the ambiguities and contradictions, there's a way in which this term, sustainable development, is got that way of creating a big tent that a lot of people can kind of get around. And that creative ambiguity, that's a term that they use several times throughout the article, allows us to kind of bring together a broad set of actors and institutions to try to figure out how to do this work. So on the one hand, you could say, that's a good thing, right? Creative ambiguity, even though it's ambiguous, maybe it allows us to kind of have this interaction, have this way in which we can kind of gather under that big tent and decide what kind of shared goals, values, and practices that we do have. On the other hand, maybe it's so ambiguous that it doesn't really mean anything, or it's a contradiction. And that's something we really want to talk about. So I do have a couple of discussion questions to kind of finish off here. Is sustainability creative, if ambiguous, compromise, or is it flawed? Is it a path that we don't want to follow because it doesn't actually give us a critical enough edge on where we are as a society and where we want to be in the future? That's a big question. We won't necessarily answer that one, but I'd be curious to hear about what you think. What's your perspective on that? And more practically, how do we balance those issues in our own work? If we're actually going to do some kind of sustainable development work to support the community, either on campus or in the Hamilton community, how do we achieve that? How do we take a thing that might be somewhat flawed as a term, ambiguous as a term, and use it? And what kinds of things do we actually have to take for granted? Are there challenges that we're going to face because of the way that sustainability is defined or not defined, if we kind of take that more ambiguous side of things? And are there any pitfalls there for us using sustainability as a framework for community engagement? Those are some of the things that we'll want to talk about and get into a little bit more detail in our class discussions this week. So that's it for this video. I will have another one where I'm going to say briefly a few things about the Bostrom article. And I think those will be the 2 videos that we'll have for class this week. So that's all for now, and I'll see you soon. Bye.